Hello and welcome to this online-only CocoaHeadsNL meetup. We're still hopeful that we will be able to host a real in-person meetup sometime this year. If only it will be our traditional Christmas drink in December. We'll see. For the people that are new to CocoaHeadsNL, we are a monthly meetup group for Apple developers. We are part of the international CocoaHeads and talk about anything Apple related. First, we'd like to thank our regular sponsors. They make it possible for us to host our meetups and to record and stream them as well. If your company is interested in sponsoring, please contact the CocoaHeadsNL team. We also like to point you to our apparel shop at cocoaheads.nl/shop. If you buy any of these products, you help us to host these meetups. This month we will give away again 2 JetBrains licenses for any of their products. If you win, you can choose for which product. The license is valid for a full year. You can enter the raffle by simply entering the Meetups channel on the CocoaHeadsNL Slack at cocoaheadsnl.slack.com. If you don't have access to that yet, you can use this invite link and we'll add you soon. This month we have a talk from Dani Devesa, who is an accessibility engineer at Spotify in London. He's born and raised in Spain, but visits the Netherlands regularly as his mother is Dutch. Building iOS apps with an accessibility mindset requires keeping a few considerations in mind at all times. The user base is very diverse. Customizability and good UX are at the core of accessible apps, and accessibility is part of the job for any developer and the right thing to do. But it also requires knowing what the platform has to offer, including VoiceOver, switch control or voice control, and how to support it effectively. Dani explores what we have available in iOS to create more accessible apps. We are still finalizing plans for next month's meetup, so keep an eye on the meetup page or any of our social media channels for an announcement. One thing is certain, and that is that this meetup will still be an online meetup. We are looking at what is possible to host an in-person meetup again somewhere in the last quarter of this year. Of course, this will and must comply within the corona rules of the Dutch government. If your company is interested in hosting a meetup in the last quarter of 2021, please contact the CocoaHeadsNL team. If you don't want to miss any of our videos, please download our Apple TV app or subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's the easiest way to see every video that we publish. If you are looking for a new challenge, check out the jobs posted on our CocoaHeadsNL website, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter. We hope you enjoyed this month's talk and hopefully we will be able to see each other at a regular meetup very soon. I now hand it over to Dani.
Hey everyone, welcome to Developing iOS Apps with an Accessibility Mindset. I wanted to start this talk with this fantastic illustration from Raoul Hill that is inspired by the curb cut effect. So the curb cut effect asserts that when you design with disability in mind, like in this case a curb cut was designed for wheelchair users, you may end up benefiting a much wider group of people than you firstly anticipated. In the illustration you can see a man riding a wheelchair while using a curb cut, followed by a young skater, an old lady with a walker, and a man walking with a crutch. But new parents with a pushchair, or a delivery person with a delivery trolley, or cyclists would benefit from it too. And I totally think that accessible iOS apps achieve the curb cut effect, and they make much better apps for everyone. A quick word about me. My name is Dani Devesa. I'm from Xàbia, Spain. My mom is Dutch, so I love to go to the Netherlands from time to time, and I hope we can meet in person one day. But I'm currently based in London, where I work as an iOS engineer in the amazing accessibility team at Spotify. I love learning about ways of making apps more accessible, and that brought me to write a book called Developing Accessible iOS Apps. And today I just wanted to talk to you a bit about my experience and how I think you can achieve an accessibility mindset when it comes to creating iOS apps too. And it all started in this moment, right? The year is 2007 and Steve Jobs comes out of stage and announces a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communicator device. And of course, these were not three separate devices, it was the iPhone. And it came to revolutionize the smartphone industry and to change how we interact with digital products forever. And there was a lot of skepticism around the iPhone, believe it or not. And I don't know if you remember Steve Ballmer, Microsoft CEO at the time, that famously laughed when asked about the iPhone, saying that it was the most expensive phone in the world and that it wouldn't appeal business customers because it didn't have a keyboard, making it not a very good email machine. And you know, now it can seem like a flagrant underestimation what he said, and obviously it was, but surely wasn't as clear back then, and he was not alone. Actually, another very good reason for being skeptic about the capabilities of the iPhone was, how can this device be accessible at all? In the end, it consisted of a flat sheet of glass, very small, no keyboard, and barely any buttons at all. But 2 years later, in June 2009, Apple launched VoiceOver for iPhone OS, and that changed everything. It was just the beginning, but what was once an unlikely accessible device kept improving, and more features were added over the years, helping users with different abilities to effectively access digital services. iOS has so much more to offer now, and Apple has done actually a great job at providing us developers with the technologies, APIs, and tools to create truly accessible apps. And I think it would be just foolish not to take advantage of all of it. So let's see what we can do to develop great accessible apps that anyone can use and enjoy by embracing an accessibility mindset. So what do I mean by an accessibility mindset? In my opinion, developing accessible apps is not more difficult or time-consuming, contrary to what a lot of people may think. Not at least if you keep in mind a few considerations along the development process, from the beginning to the end. It might be harder at the beginning, yes. I think sometimes it can feel even a bit overwhelming, but I promise that it quickly improves with practice. Soon after you start, you will suddenly realize that accessibility seamlessly becomes part of your job because you reached an accessibility mindset. And to go there, I try to keep three things in mind at all times. One, that our user base is diverse. Two, that accessibility is good UX and it relies on customizability. And three, that accessibility is just part of jobs as iOS developers and simply the right thing to do. So it all starts by acknowledging that we have a diverse user base, right? Apple classifies its efforts in making apps more accessible into 4 different categories: cognitive, motor, vision, and hearing. And each one of these represent a unique set of considerations and challenges for us developers. I think we also tend to think about disabilities in terms of extremes, but I think it's more accurate to think about it as a spectrum of abilities. When developing an app, we may think of totally blind users, for example, but vision impairments take many forms and different degrees, including color blindness. 1 in 12 men, more than 8%, actually have a green-red color deficiency. And disabilities are not always permanent. They can also be temporary or situational. We could have just had a laser eye surgery, or we could be driving a car. In both of these cases, you won't be able to see your apps in the way you might usually do for just a period of time or in a given situation. To me, this was eye-opening. We all benefit from good accessibility, from assistive technologies, and this is a good reminder that accessibility is for everyone. So we are all different and we all have different abilities. Not everyone will look at your app when consuming information. They might listen to it or use a braille display, for example. And not everyone will touch and swipe the screen to interact with it. You could also use your voice, a keyboard, or a single or multiple switches. A good mobile app allows customization. It abstracts its user experience to a level that allows multiple input and output mechanisms. It lets the user choose how they want or need to use their devices. Some time ago, I was listening to an episode of the great Stack Trace podcast, and in it, Guy Rambo pointed out that you can actually do some customization of how you use your AirPods in the accessibility menu. And Johnson Dell replied saying, like, at this point, Apple should rename accessibility to customizability. And it was just a joke, but I think he was spot on. Customization is at the core of accessibility. I don't think I'm the only one that uses dark mode or Siri or subtitles, perhaps. And all these things are customizations that I would classify as mainstream accessibility features. And if you're not making apps accessible, you're simply neglecting a very important part of your job. Noel Swift, an Apple engineer, said in one of her videos that we have one job, and that's to make our apps work. And if you're not implementing accessibility features, you're forgetting about making it work for a lot of people. And she's completely right. If you find out that there is an accessibility issue with your app, you have to treat it as a bug, because that's what it is. No more putting it in the backlog for future prioritization. In my opinion, it is a showstopper because it means that there are users that cannot use your app properly. And as Tim Cook said very clearly in one of his tweets, accessibility rights are human rights. Once you have all these considerations in mind, it is very important to know also what the system has to offer. So let's explore together what's available in iOS and how we can create more accessible apps. And we'll start by learning a bit more about UI accessibility, because it is the cornerstone of any accessible iOS app. It is a protocol that provides accessibility information about views and controls in an app's user interface. In this slide, I'll try to simplify a bit how it works. So imagine that we are creating an app for keeping track of our favorite conferences, meetups, and events, and we run it on one of the latest iPhones in the market. Of course, CocoaHeadsNL is one of my favorite meetups. Using VoiceOver, you can move your finger around the screen, and then VoiceOver will speak out loud the element that is underneath your screen. But more commonly, you can swipe left to get to the previous element on the screen, or right to get to the next one. In this app, VoiceOver would say something like event heading. Swipe right, and it would say something like done button. Swipe right, and then it would say meetup name, CocoaHeadsNL, text field. Double tap to edit. And if we swipe right one more time, it will say something like rating 100% adjustable. Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value. So how can we achieve this behavior? Everything that VoiceOver just said is not a single blob of text. Instead, it is formed and configured using 4 different properties. We have an accessibility label, a value, a trait, and a hint. And by the way, you'll see that a lot of examples in this talk, like in this case, for example, are based on VoiceOver. And this is mainly because it is arguably the most popular assistive technology in iOS, and also because it can feel challenging sometimes, and because by creating good VoiceOver experiences, it is very likely that you're improving the experience for other assistive technologies such as voice control or switch control, because all of them work on top of UI accessibility. And we'll see some examples when this happens later in the talk. Now, let's see how this looks in code. We can install Xcode in our fancy Mac, and configuring any properties we've seen before will look something like this. So here we have is accessibility element, and most UIKit controls have this property set to true by default, but it is false for plain UIVs, for example. It is very tempting to think that by making everything an accessibility element, you'll make an accessible app, but this is not always necessary and not even a good practice. For example, in the previous example, the UI label before the text field may be considered redundant, and therefore we might want to set this property to false for the label. Or we might want to skip a decorative image that is not conveying any relevant information to the user. Then we have the accessibility label, and it is a string, and it's super important that it needs to be localized if you support more than one language in your app. It is often derived from the controls title, if there is one, so a lot of times you won't need to set one. Then we have the accessibility traits, and that's the role of the component. It indicates how you can interact or not with it. A UI control may have more than one trait actually. In Swift you can assign, you can insert, and you can remove traits. Some examples of traits are, as we've seen before, button, or header, or adjustable, but also we have something like selected, not enabled, updates frequently, etc. There are many. And then we have the accessibility value. We've seen also a couple examples. In the case of the text field, the accessibility value is the text that you're typing in the text field. And in case of the slider, depending on where you stop the slider, it will have one value or another. And then we have an accessibility hint, which is optional and is useful if the UI component needs further clarification on how it's used. But it is important to note that it is read after a pause, so experienced users may skip it or even have them disabled altogether. So it's good for clarification, but your UI component should really need it for users to understand how to use it. And as you know, Apple offers a bunch of UI controls in its UIKit framework. When using these controls, you barely have to do anything, as all these components have sensible, pre-configured properties to make them accessible. So one good piece of advice is stick as much as possible to UIKit components if you make accessible apps. If you want to create your own custom components, that's fine, but then you'll need to do a bit more work. And you may also be thinking, what about Swift UI? So all the examples in this talk are on UIKit, but most of the times you find equivalent accessibility attachment modifiers to properties that you can actually find in UI accessibility protocol. So good accessibility labels are at the core of good accessible apps. As we've seen before, a lot of times you will need to manually configure an accessibility label as it gets inferred from the UI component's title, but sometimes, like in this case, where the button doesn't have a title, you'll have to manually specify one. Otherwise, VoiceOver may try to figure out what's the most suitable and the next most suitable thing that works as an accessibility label. Sometimes it may use the name of the image, and as you can see, it's not a great experience. Sometimes it may just say button, and then you have no idea what that button does. And sometimes you may be lucky enough, and VoiceOver might be able to figure out what the button means for the user. But we can do better. As much as it might surprise you, this actually is one of the most common accessibility issues that you can find in iOS apps. Also, just a reminder that you need to specify the type of the control in the accessibility label, because it is configured using the accessibility trait, and it would result in some redundancy with VoiceOver saying something like close button button. In the case of a button that closes a modal view, close is just a perfectly fine accessibility label. And sometimes you may want to tweak the accessibility labels so it sounds a bit more natural. It is important to frequently test your apps in real devices because you may find that VoiceOver won't always work as you expected. And although the users may figure out what's going on, it is not quite right and definitely not the best experience we can offer. For things like durations and times, you can use date formatters to get readable versions, and we'll see how you can tweak VoiceOver's pronunciation in the next slide. Because VoiceOver is really customizable. The same way you can have accessibility labels, you can have attributed accessibility labels. And that lets you specify some extra properties for all or part of the label. In this case, paella is a rice dish that is very typical from Valencia, the region I'm from in Spain. And when you are using VoiceOver in English, it pronounces it as pila. And obviously that's super annoying to me. But luckily, you can do something as simple as specifying the IPA, or International Phonetic Alphabet Notation, to correct VoiceOver's pronunciation. Another solution for this particular use case would be to specify the language VoiceOver should use. Other things you can do with attributed accessibility labels are getting VoiceOver to read punctuation marks, if it makes sense, or you can even change the pitch. And after configuring good labels, it is important to configure the right accessibility traits too. I'm going to focus now on a particular trait that I consider super important, and it is often missed, and that's the heading trait. Headers are important to visually structure information, and they help us to quickly find what we're looking for. It works the same way with VoiceOver. With VoiceOver, you can also navigate through headings by using a menu called the rotor. With VoiceOver, you can rotate 2 fingers on the screen as if you were trying to rotate an invisible knob, and the rotor menu will show up and will allow you to select one of its multiple navigation options. If you select headings, a single swipe up or down will move VoiceOver's focus from the previous to the next heading. In the example in the slide, where we have some topic clouds with artists, genres, and albums, you need 10 swipes to get to the right to get from artists to genres, but just a single swipe down is enough when you're navigating through headings. The rotor is also highly customizable, and some other options that you can find or configure are you can navigate character by character, you can navigate word by word, or you can change the speaking rate if it's too fast or too slow for you, or even the typing mode for the keyboard. And you can even create your own custom options, which I think is pretty cool. For this to work, all you need to do is to configure the header trait to anything that represents a heading in your app. It's a super simple change in the code with a huge positive impact for the user. And another important concept in VoiceOver is notifications. A simplified way of explaining how VoiceOver works is it asks your app for the elements on the screen, which will return a structured tree with their necessary metadata. That means that sometimes if things on screen change, we may need to notify VoiceOver that happened. A common use case for this is when presenting custom pop-ups, popovers, modals, action sheets, etc. In this case, we can post a notification, a screen change notification, when the buy button is tapped, and move VoiceOver's focus to the custom modal view. Posting a screen change notification will also play a sound indicating the user that they basically got moved to a new screen. And to post a notification, you can call post on UI accessibility. The first parameter is the type of the notification, and the second one is the view where you would like to move VoiceOver's focus to. The second line of code in this example is super important as well. When presenting a UI component that overlays an existing UI, like in this case a custom pop-up, you may have found that when navigating with VoiceOver, because it goes from left to right and top to bottom, it starts jumping randomly in between the overlaid UI and the elements underneath. That's super confusing. And to avoid that, you can specify the presented view is a modal view in accessibility terms. And if you do that, VoiceOver will just ignore its sibling views. Another interesting type of notification is the announcement notification. It can help alert the user that something happened in a part of the screen that is not currently on focus, but that is not important enough for us to disrupt the user by moving VoiceOver's focus somewhere else. It can be useful also to announce certain messages like errors or long-running tasks that have just finished. And it's also useful for UI components like custom notifications or snack bars or things like that. The API for that is the same as with the screen change notification, but in this case you can pass a message as the second parameter. The message can be actually a plain string or an attributed string. If you pass an attribute string, you can configure an attribute that is called accessibility speech queue announcement, and that will tell VoiceOver to start queuing announcements that you're posting, or otherwise it would start interrupting any ongoing announcements. And here are a couple advanced VoiceOver gestures for power users. This first one is called the escape gesture, and it is a two-finger scrub on the screen, kind of like trying to draw a Z, and it means back. You'll see that this works by default in navigation controllers, but you need to implement this gesture behavior yourself for most modal views, or if you have any component that is presented in a custom way. I call UIs that don't implement this gesture escape rooms, because a lot of times if they don't implement this gesture, it means that the user can get stuck in some parts of your app. The good news is that it's super simple to implement. You just need to override the accessibility perform escape method in your presented view. That will capture that gesture for you, and you can just do whatever you need to dismiss the view, and the last step is to return true if you successfully handle the gesture. And the second advanced gesture I wanted to show you today is Magic Tap. It is a double tap with two fingers. The Magic Tap is meant to execute the main action in the current screen of your app. Think of it like as good examples, for example, like play pause for music or video streaming app. It could also be for taking a picture in a camera app, or starting and stopping a timer in a cooking app. And implementing this is as simple as for the perform escape gesture example. You can just override accessibility perform magic tap function. That will again help you to capture the gesture for you. You'll be able to trigger the main functionality of the app and then return true. And just one more thing on VoiceOver, and that's custom actions. Custom actions let you perform actions on the focused element by VoiceOver, again by using the rotor. Custom actions are great for when a particular action is executed with a gesture that is then overridden by VoiceOver. Think of the reply or archive actions when swiping a cell on the mail app, but it is also, more importantly, great for making navigation faster by hiding certain actions you can perform in every single item of a collection. A great example would be a Twitter-like app like this one. Imagine that you want to go from one post to the other, and ideally you just want to swipe once to the right. But if you let VoiceOver's focus into every single action that you can perform in each one of these posts, like going to the username or repost, like, or share, you'll end up needing at least 5 swipes instead of 1. That would be super redundant. Most of the info you'll be listening is the same all the time. Plus, it may not be clear anymore which post you would be liking or sharing anymore when you've been navigating in the app for a while. With custom actions, you can stop at any post, swipe up or down to rotate through the different options that would be announced by VoiceOver, and when you get to the one that you like, just double tap anywhere in the screen and that action will be executed. And to implement this, you can create an array of custom actions for each one of the accessibility elements. Each action has a name and an action to perform. Since iOS 13, there's actually a Swiftier block-based API that you can use instead of this target selector one. And in iOS 14, you can assign them an image too. Why an image, you may think, for VoiceOver users? So that's so you can use them in switch control menus. As we said at the beginning of the talk, sometimes by improving VoiceOver's experience, you can actually benefit and make the experience better for other assistive technology users too. And custom actions is a good example of that. It makes navigating with switch control much faster too. And now by adding an icon to the action, it makes finding them much easier in the switch control menu. And moving from VoiceOver, a very important part of iOS apps being accessible is avoiding the one-size-fits-all strategy. It is better to have dynamic apps that adapt to the user preferences. By allowing them to do the necessary adjustments and customizations, our users will be able to enjoy our apps independently of their abilities and needs. iOS actually offers a ton of configurations that let you know what the user's preferences are, and you can then react to offer them a suitable experience. One of the last options added and introduced by Apple in iOS 13 actually was should differentiate without color. I think the best example for this particular configuration is games, as you may know that by default it is not a good practice to rely solely on color to convey important information to the user. Imagine that you are developing a Uno-like game where a user throws a card based on the color and the number of the previous player's card. You could use this option to add a symbol to the card, so colorblind users can easily identify which card they can play. How otherwise would you know which color is each one of these cards in a black and white presentation? Actually, Mattel has developed a colorblind-friendly version of its game that uses the colorblind alphabet to differentiate the colors of its card, and that's the symbol that you can see next to the number. In iOS, there are two things you can do with each one of these configurations. You can check if they're enabled or not, or you can also listen to notifications in case the user changes their preferences while using your app. And there are many more. Reduce motion and reduce transparency are two important ones. Reduce motion lets you soften animations or remove them altogether, as users could suffer from motion sickness or they could feel dizzy with repeating or abrupt animations. Reduce transparency lets you make certain parts of your app less transparent, improving contrast and also removing distractions. Implementing these customizations is super important because we should be good citizen developers by honoring our users' preferences. And since iOS 13, you can control the phone with your voice. And I'm not talking about Siri, but Apple called this feature VoiceControl, and it's super cool. It also uses accessibility labels, but sometimes, though, you may find that the labels are correct, but maybe they're too long for interactions. Or some of the times you may find that users would think of the same interaction with different names. For example, for a settings button, a user could say tab settings or tab configuration or tab preferences. But if the accessibility label of the settings button is settings, only the first one of these three commands will work. Luckily, Apple has provided a solution for this situation, and you can create an accessibility user input labels array, and you can provide a list of different input alternatives. And another super important feature in iOS is dynamic type. Dynamic type allows the user to change their preferred font size in the system settings. I think it might be actually the most widely used assistive technology in iOS, with many of us probably needing to use it at any point in our lives. Sizes for dynamic type go from extra small to extra large. And then you can enable 5 extra accessibility text sizes. For using dynamic type, instead of defining your own custom font sizes and styles, you can get the preferred font based on a predefined style by Apple. That can be title, header, body, etc. And you can even use custom fonts if you want. And for them to scale accordingly, you can use the UI font metrics class. Setting also the adjust font for content size category to true will automatically adapt the size of the font if the user decides to change the preference while using your app. But what is the point of offering your users to go from this to something like this? The font scales to the user's preference, but it really doesn't play well with the layout. We have a bigger font but less content, so it doesn't necessarily translate into a better experience. How we can solve this? Well, we can provide alternative layouts for larger font sizes, actually in a few different ways. One of the things you can do is to have an entirely different layout as a separate nib file. If your preference though is to create the UI layout using code, you can have different sets of layout constraints for smaller and larger font sizes, and then you can deactivate them depending on the text size that the user has chosen. And also a great tip, I think, is to lay out things using stack views, because in this particular example, you could just change the axis from horizontal to vertical when the user configures a font that is larger than a given threshold. Because you can check if the preferred content size category is an accessibility size or if it's larger than a given size. And in that case, you can use an alternative layout or make any necessary adjustments. And in case you think it is not really important to support such large font sizes, I try to exemplify here how a low-vision user may perceive your font. As you can see with the example with the largest font size, it may still be readable, but with the one with the default text size, it's barely usable at all. And the development of any accessible app cycle starts and ends with testing. It allows you to find issues in your app and also to check if the fixes that you applied work as expected. I'll say this one more time, please always try to test with real devices. But I know that while developing, it might be just easier to use the accessibility inspector in the simulator. And the accessibility inspector is actually super useful. It lets you inspect the accessibility properties that you configured in your app, the ones that we've seen at the beginning of the talk. You can also run a quick audit, and it will automatically find for you some potential issues in your app. And you can even change some of the preferences we talked about and see how they affect your app. Other things you can do is you can test VoiceOver with screen curtain on. That's super fun. It will switch off the screen device for you, but you will be able to use your app with VoiceOver. You can change the preferences using environment overrides in Xcode instead of in the accessibility inspector as well. I think it's super useful to configure accessibility shortcuts in your phone because it makes testing much faster and easier. And you can also use the color contrast calculator in Xcode to see that you have enough color contrast ratios in the different parts of your app. All of these things I think are great strategies for testing the accessibility of your app. And I don't know if you've seen a movie that is called This is the Spinal Tap. It is a comedy, a mockumentary from the 80s about an English rock band that is called Spinal Tap. There is a scene in the movie where the director is interviewing one of the guitarists of the band, and the guitarist probably shows his amplifiers where all the numbers go up to 11 instead of 10. The director curiously asks if that makes any difference at all, and the guitarist says that of course, that means that they're one louder than the rest. And it is just a joke in the movie, but it has become an expression for showing that you're not happy with average, that you want to go one step further. I like to think that we should do that for when it comes to accessibility. Our iOS apps being accessible should be a given by now, and we should be willing to go the extra mile to create great accessible experiences that absolutely all users love. We should bring the accessibility levels of our apps up to 11. And that's all I had for you today. I hope you found some useful info in this talk, and I hope it helps you to develop iOS apps with an accessibility mindset. You can find me on Twitter with the handle @thederk, and I'm looking forward to continue the discussion with you and to try to answering any questions you may have. Dankjewel, and thank you. Hey, so time for questions. It can be anything related to the talk, but also anything that you think I forgot mentioning, or like I would like to know what you thought about it. Is there anything in particular that that surprised you, or you didn't know about, or anything I missed? I can see some comments coming through at the moment. There is one from Bas Brook. Did you know that the Magic Tab was initially play pause? And I didn't know that. That's amazing. Really cool. I guess as a lot of things, Apple has a way of doing things, and then they realize that it is something that would be useful for developers, so they open the APIs sometime later. For example, there was this very cool feature in the Stocks app where you could listen to the graphs. And actually, since iOS 15, you can do that yourself in your apps as well, and that's very cool. And also he mentions that in Monterey, it also works in Catalyst apps if you implement it. So yeah, if you are working on Catalyst apps, totally recommend to do that. You can either assign Magic Tab or use the trackpad commander and do two-finger double tap in the center of the trackpad. That's super cool. Didn't know that either. And also, he has a very good point and says that please make sure to localize your user input labels. Yeah, that's super important. Same way that you have to localize accessibility labels, don't forget to localize any user input labels, or also any hints or values, accessibility values. Whatever is a string is a very good idea to localize it, so it works in other languages as well. What else? Yeah, a lot of people mentioning the functionality to be able to let VoiceOver know how they should pronounce certain words using the IPA notation. Yeah, I think that's super cool as well. Also, another question from Yolanda, a great talk. Did you do the illustrations yourself? Yeah, I did them with the iPad Pro. I used the Procreate app, which is super cool as well. At the beginning, I started drawing them myself, but then it was a lot of work, so I started cheating, I guess, and then I dragged an image and then removed applied a bit of alpha and then drew on top of the image. But yeah, that was a lot of fun to work on the presentation. Let's see if there are any other questions coming through. Also, if it happens, as it happens sometimes, that as soon as we finish this, you have this burning question that came out, don't hesitate to find me in the CocoaHeads Slack workspace or Twitter as well. See, there's another question here. Instead of using two layouts when the font gets big, isn't it wiser to just have the one for the biggest font? Otherwise, it seems double work and double maintenance. And yeah, that's a very good point. In general, I would say that you want to keep the experience as similar as possible for different assistive technologies. Sometimes, though, layouts, the same way that they get more efficient in one way for large sizes, text sizes, a different layout is more efficient for small sizes. So if you think about the example where you had an image and then the text next to it, it lets you fit more content in the screen when you have like a particular text size. It's just not a very good layout for big sizes, if it makes sense. So I would say yes. If there's a layout that works both for a large font and a small font, I would use that. But if that's not possible, you can still use this trick. And then another one. So this is a beautiful vision for how we want to make great apps, but the extra attention to detail absolutely does cost developer time. How do you get your org to buy into taking it to 11? And yeah, that's a very good point. So I'd say that it takes a bit of time, of course. So it takes some advocacy and to like sell your love for accessibility to other people in your organization sometimes. But I find that that's usually super easy. So most of the time when you are speaking about something that you can do, the other person would say something like, I didn't know about it, I'm going to do it from now on. And I think usually you tend to achieve this snowball effect, right? Where you do something yourself and someone that is reviewing your PR notices it, or you make a comment in someone else's PR and suddenly that other person like starts like reviewing other PRs and making comments in other PRs. Like, I think, yeah, it's getting the ball rolling. And also I think it's important to for example, if you're developing a new feature, make a demo and show the others that what you can do and how it works. So yeah, little by little it builds up, in my opinion. And yeah, I think once it settles, it becomes very natural and it doesn't really take much more time. So that's cool. We have one more question. How do I convince a designer to support dynamic type? I always get such tight layouts that I can use them at all. And yeah, that's also a good point. Usually, not usually, but a lot of times you get designs that the designer wants for you to do a pixel perfect representation of it, right? And that's not always possible because back then when we had one size iPhone, maybe yes, but now we have many sizes. We have, like iPad as well. We have Catalyst apps. It's almost impossible to predict how a layout will look like in all the devices. And dynamic type. So my suggestion for your designer would be, if you support dynamic type, it will work better with localization, for example, because usually your app will be able to accommodate larger or a bigger amount of text. It will flow better when there's more or less text. So if you are opening to other markets, that's very important. And also, I think I've seen some data on the internet where I've seen that dynamic type is actually used by a lot of people, something like around 25-30%, depending on the data I've seen. Not always is larger sizes. Like a lot of people prefers to have like a smaller text size to fit more content on the screen. So I would definitely go for it. And another good reason as well is, at some point in our lives, I think most of us will need it. So even your designer. So yeah, I hope that works. Let's see. I think that's going to be all for today, but yeah, as I said, any questions, I'll be on Slack, on Twitter. My Twitter handle is dadederk, and my website is dadederk.com if you want to find some blog posts that I've been writing as well. And yeah, this has been so much fun. Thanks to the CocoaHeadsNL team for putting this together, and I hope to see you in person at some point soon. Thank you so much.